Today at Fide Foundations, we have Marc de Vos, full professor at Ghent University and also expert of the Itinera Institute. He's presenting his new book, Superpower Europe, the European Union's Silent Revolution. So, first of all, welcome, Marc, and congratulations for your new book.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Pleasure to be with you.
The book is a brilliant analysis based on, I would say, both a political and economic analysis approach, particularly focused on the EU. Since the very beginning of the book, you are proposing a sort of a coalition between Western and Eastern Europe, a sort of Eurasian geostrategic coalition. Can you explain us this idea?
Well, look, the book is both observation and aspiration. The observation stems from making a survey of all the major policy decisions that were taken in the previous European Commission, the first von der Leyen Commission. And the cumulative effect of all these decisions, in my view, is that the EU, by reacting to the external crisis around it, whether that's the pandemic or the war in Ukraine or the trade war between China and the United States, or the hybrid war that Russia is doing in terms of security, safety, sabotage and media, and so on, that all the measures that the EU has taken vis-à-vis these external crises, if you add them all up, you notice that the EU itself has changed fundamentally. That's the observation of the book. And coming to your question then, around geography, which is one of the things where we are in a new era with the European Union. Because of the Russian threat, we now see that probably the primary mission of the European Union is to achieve security geographically on the Eurasian continent. And if you have initiatives like the new European political community that very few people have heard of, but that has been created in 2022 after the invasion of the Ukraine, which is the European Union countries and a whole string of other countries that are potentially member states of the EU, but potentially not, that are also, like the UK, former member states, but are back in the European political community. That European political community is a Eurasian, partially Eurasian cluster of European countries and periphery countries. And that for me is a real fundamental shift in the logic of membership. Why do you want to be connected strategically to the European Union? You do it first and foremost for safety, security, border controls, stopping the risks that are there if you're not allied to the European Union. You basically are dealing with a buffer zone between Russia and Europe. And all the countries in that buffer zone have to answer for them the question, which way do you want to go? And the European Union is trying to pull a number of countries into the orbit of Europe. And that is a different kind of exercise than the old membership. The old membership was everybody wants to join us because we're just a market. And so we can ask you to follow all our rules and you come begging basically on your knees to join us. But now we want you to be in our part of the club. We want you to be part of our coalition. Now we have to pull and convince these countries actually to choose Europe. And the example of Ukraine is an example there. You can look at Moldova, you can look at the Balkan countries, you can look at Turkey, which has achieved a new importance for Europe in this new world that we're in. And that's one of the kind of thesis of the book, is that the European Union, the future of the European Union, will depend on the EU successfully doing this type of coalition building. So that's why I say we should understand Europe as being more than Europe and partially Eurasian.
You said you mentioned the trade war And you use these words, trade war. Now we are living a new context with the re-election of Donald Trump as US president. What is the position of the EU in this new context?
Yeah, we have to understand, I think, that Europe has a very, very significant challenge here. The European Union basically is European globalization. It's countries that came together, forming one market, taking the state out of the market, free trade, open and fair competition. And we did that partially because we needed and wanted to as European countries, but also because that was the way the world was going, through international free trade, and eventually the era of globalization. And that's how we then got connected with China and Russia from a trade perspective. We thought that was the only perspective that really mattered. All the rest would follow. Now that world is over. We face three significant threats. We have Russia, we have China, and we have the United States under Trump at the same time. It's very hard for Europe to grapple with that because we are not constructed. The European Union is a free trade club. It's not constructed as a geopolitical force, and that is what trade has become. That's the argument that I make in my book. The things that used to be markets and business, which is technology, energy, all types of value chains around all types of products. You can even say agriculture and food. All these things that we used to think of as being commercial relations have, in the new world that we're in, become partially geopolitical relations. We can only do trade if it aligns with geopolitical interests. And so that's the challenge for us if we have three geopolitical competitors at the same time. And so, Europe will have a very tough few years ahead of itself, I think, to navigate that complexity. Obviously, Russia and the trade with Russia, economic relationships with Russia, is more or less out of the window for the time being, but not 100%. We are still doing trade in natural gas and some oil products. And also in terms of the value chain of nuclear energy, we are still doing trade with Russia. China, we will have to answer the China question for us. How do we want to position ourselves as a group of countries vis-à-vis China? Do we want a separate position as Europe than the United States will have, which is definitely going to be confrontational with China? And do we think that we can pull that off? Are we strong enough? Are we independent enough? Autonomous enough to have a position vis-à-vis China that doesn't follow the US position? Because if we don't follow the US position, there will probably be consequences about the position of the US in Europe vis-à-vis Russia and Ukraine. And we need the US and Russia, we need the US in Europe to deal with Russia and Ukraine. So that kind of balancing act for the European Union is going to be very hard to do because we have not been set up like that. So there is no coherent geopolitical vision or strategy. For that you need a common international strategy. And there are a lot of diverging national interests. And a number of very big and relevant countries have diverging interests. You can look at Germany, you can look at France, you can look at Italy, you can look at Poland. Spain also has peculiar positions in some regards. Spain was already the target of Chinese kind of blackmail with the export of pork. It's doing business with Chinese battery production companies. So it's a really complex thing to do as the EU, and it's the only way that we can do it. We can't do it individually. We can't do it on a member state level because then it's chaos, and then we are going to be the victims of this new geopolitical reality. We have to find a common ground somehow. So I see that as one of the very biggest challenges of the near future. And my position in the book that I defend, which is obviously a personal position, is that we should align ourselves with the United States as much as possible. and that we should make an approach to the United States that makes the United States to a significant degree a geopolitical ally, both vis-à-vis Russia and vis-à-vis China. That's the position I take, but there are alternatives to consider, provided you can actually do them, and this is where the European Union then comes into this phase of what does it need economically then to be sufficiently strong as a geopolitical actor, which is another theme in the book.
The situation is very complex in the economic arena, as you are suggesting, but it's even more complex if we take into consideration something that you mentioned before, that is instability, and particularly two wars, one in Ukraine and another one in Israel and Palestine. This is a challenge also for Europe, such as international actor, right?
Absolutely, and then look, the challenge that we have as Europe coincides with the fact that the West in general, whether it is the US or Europe, but what we stand for in the West, in terms of rules, institutions, human rights, and so on, are not popular anymore globally. Quite the contrary. So beyond the geopolitical adversaries, there are quite a few countries out there that are not necessarily in favor of a Western or European position. And that are potentially kind of open to being influenced by a Chinese agenda, particularly if it comes with investment and so on. So yes, it's a difficult environment for us to establish from Europe a sort of international position, because our economy is heavily dependent on a number of international supply chains. Our economy is vulnerable to all kinds of risks vis-à-vis both China and the United States. So there's going to be a big need, if we are serious about having a degree of self-determination in Europe, in the world. If we are serious about that, then we will have to do a big exercise of establishing strategic autonomy and self-control and self-reliance in a number of critical industries and technologies. And if you want to do that, that immediately has consequences on the geopolitical relationships that you have and the trade relationships that you have. That's why since my book was published, we got the Draghi report advocating for 800 billion euro investment every single year for the European Union to catch up in a number of areas. So I think that is going to be the question, really. That's what it boils down to, I think, really, in addressing your question, is whether we will be able to fast track a kind of autonomous European force, economically, technologically, that we control, that is made in Europe. And if we can do that, that will enable us in these difficult relationships in a world that is not very supportive and enthusiastic about the West. It will enable us to have grown-up relationships. But I think this is what we will need, unless we achieve a very significant strategic new partnership, a new partnership for a new world with the United States, and continue to rely on that partnership with the United States, which I wouldn't go for. I think we need more autonomy and control, but that is definitely also a possibility. So yeah, it's a big ask for 27 countries. There is no federal European power to do what Beijing or Washington DC is doing or could do if they wanted to. Here it's 27 countries, capitals. It's also, we are both lawyers by trade. The distinction between what is EU level power and what is domestic level has completely blurred. It's one mix, one gray zone. It's very hard to navigate that politically and to keep momentum, to keep pace. So yeah, it's a hard call, but I think it's the call we have to answer in Europe. And so far, a lot of decisions have been taken. That's why I call the book Superpower Europe, because all the things that we have been talking about, security, defense, geopolitics, autonomy, that's about creating a big power player. Yeah? So that's why I call it Superpower Europe. And we have already taken quite a few steps in that direction. But the steps are small compared to what the US has been doing, also under Biden. It's small compared to what China has been doing. It's, of course, small compared to what Mr. Putin has done. And so, in relative terms, we feel threatened by the evolutions in other countries. And so, we need to accelerate somehow. And for that, we need, in my view, we need a sufficient degree of political leadership in a sufficient number of countries. That's how I see the way forward, personally.
In your book, you highlight the connection between the economic context, the instability related to wars, and also migration. Migration is at the core of the political debate. It was in the US campaign. It is also at the core of the political debate here in Europe. But it seems, from my point, it seems that there's no clear position, at least from the European perspective. The Commission is changing now its position from a situation in which migration would be that position a little bit more flexible to another one in which it seems that the protectionism or the idea of closing borders is emerging again. What is how can the EU manage deal with migration nowadays?
Yeah. I think there are two kind of clouds, European clouds, on top of the international ones. One is migration and one is climate policy. On migration, there has been a political breakthrough. We have a migration deal and it needs to be implemented and enforced. I think that is going to be the key question. Whether we have on paper a deal where we say we have one common border with the outside world, we are going to have one way of coordinated protection of the border, and somehow we are going to evolve towards managing the inflow of refugee-seeking migrants. There are other types of migrants as well. We are going to somehow manage that in a way that keeps it a bit away from the European member states. We're going to do all kinds of international deals around that with third countries. We're going to set up certain distribution zones, and then we're going to coordinate that internally when they come on. That's on paper the goal. That is a huge step forward, obviously, for the European Union. The question is whether it can work in practice. Because, yeah, I mean, the borders are what they are, and they are quite long and complicated. And so enforcing that and making sure there aren't too many gaps, how are we going to achieve that? I mean, is going to be a border force that's also in the pipeline. How do we ensure that there is a common standard that is applied on these refugees? How can we make these external relationships where we are projecting power, which is basically the connecting point with the geopolitical agenda? We are projecting power with third countries, say we're going to manage it this way and so on. Can we actually pull that off and fund it as well? Costs money as well. So that, I think, is the key question. I don't see a lot of other political dynamics around migration unless we have a new migration crisis. That can always happen. You were referring already to wars, and things can get out of control. So I think that is delivery. And it's going to be a test, because one thing is to have a deal, another thing is to have it in practice, a reality, where all the political differences immediately come to the foreground. And that climate is a different ballgame, but it's the same kind of legacy issue that the EU is going to have to spend political capital and money on. Significant budgets are needed, on top of responding to the external challenges.
But in your book, when you analyze the special and I would say also traditional relationship and controversial relationship between the state and the market, you say the EU is now becoming a state project. What does it mean?
Well, everything that we've talked about so far, Daniel, always requires the state to take the lead. Whether it's new types of international relationships that are geopolitical, whether it's about security, whether it's about borders, whether it's about autonomy in your economy, um, um, everything goes through the state. So the state occupies an extremely central position in the new European Union's priorities and mission. Um, And the problem here is a flip side of the problem that we have with geopolitics. The EU was set up as a free trade club that wanted to keep the state out of the economy, and now it has to do the opposite. So the problem it has externally in behaving like one power bloc, it has the similar problem internally to say if the state needs to do this and this and this in Europe, well, which state actually? Because we have kept the state out of the economy. The EU itself was never set up to do that. The European Commission was set up to manage free trade and free competition in the internal market, not to be the state actor directing the internal market. If you leave it to the member states, we know what you get. You get races of subsidies, protectionism, all kinds of issues come to the foreground. It's also very complex. It's also very fragmented if you do it with 27 countries. Take the example of defense. We now say, because of the Russian invasion and the Americans no longer willing to pay for us, say we need a European defense capability. We need basically a defense market in Europe. But how do you do that? Defense always goes to the state. It's the state that pays defense. It's the primary role of the state. There isn't an EU state paying for EU defense. You have 27 states doing that. How do you go from there to a common approach where you actually have a healthy interaction between state support, state subsidies, politicization, and market forces, companies, private money, and so on. How do you get there is the big question for Europe. And coming back to the Draghi report, the 800 billion, the assumption from Draghi was that 800 billion is going to be mobilized at EU level and is going to be spent from Brussels. Which is exactly the problem. If the state is back and we need capacity in batteries and we need capacity in chip manufacturing and we need capacity in shipbuilding and we need defense capabilities and technology capacity and we need space technology capacity. We all need that in Europe. How actually are you going to do that? Because the market is not there. If you want to do it with a market model, you're back to the problem that the market no longer is the model that can actually solve this problem, because we are no longer in a market reality, we are in geopolitical reality. Coordinating that through a top-down approach is hard to do, because the EU doesn't have a centralized political power for that, and the EU also doesn't have the budget to do it. And so it then becomes a whole mosaic of all kinds of innovations with EU budgets, EU tariffs, EU projects, innovation funds, and so on and so forth. We did something similar after the pandemic with a recovery fund, with European debt. It's all for the same reason. We are lacking political power and money power to actually do this fast, clear, transparent, at scale in Europe. We are lacking that. And so a big set of issues for the next couple of years is how to respond to that. And that's where then you have basically two pillars for that. One is, well, we definitely would also need more market kind of potential for certain industries, because we have an internal market. But in defense, it's not a market. In technology, in telecommunications, it's not a market. In the capital market, where you could find firepower, private money, it's fragmented. It's not one capital market. So there is an argument to be made. The sweet spot, if you like, in Europe is to say we can do the geopolitical strategic stuff partially by doing more market stuff in Europe, partially by creating, at long last, one market for energy infrastructure, one market for telecommunication. And that's another of these big reports that were recently produced. That's the report by Letta, another former Italian prime minister, who advocates for market integration as an instrument to do strategic stuff, non-market stuff, political stuff through the market. So these two things combined, that's the duo that in policy making, the EU will have to kind of connect and find in the next couple of years, which is a huge challenge in itself, because the reason we didn't have it to date is because there's a lot of political divergence in the interests, the national interests. When you say one capital market, okay, and whose rules are going to apply for funding and for bankruptcy, and who is going to control what, and what happens with all these national authorities, and so on. So there you go. It's very complicated to do. So it's already hard to do among 27 in peacetime. That's why we didn't get it. And now we have to do it in wartime, while at the same time facing all these external challenges. Let's hope that reality kind of accelerates internal decision making. Let's hope for that. And I'm optimistic, coming back to the point that I made. I think the future is coalitions of countries, and not 27 necessarily. And you already see that in defense. There have been a number of countries that have really stepped up defense planning and spending after the war in Ukraine started, particularly on the eastern part of Europe, the Baltics, the Scandinavians, Poland, and they form coalitions to do stuff together. They will increase that effort. They will invite the UK to join that effort, to develop defense capabilities. And they will bring money to the table. And the European Commission and the European Council will applaud them, because it's going to be part of the solution for Europe. And it's better to have that very quickly than to have to wait 2 years to get somewhere, but not that far, with 27. So I think that is going to be politically the big change that we are going to see, as I said, the combination of EU action, state action, transnational state action, towards goals that we all kind of share, more or less, in the EU. Because remember, coming back to the legal perspective, none of this is federalized at the EU level.
That is why we are at the end of this conversation, but that is exactly my question, just for finishing. Speaking about the future, is the future a federation, a confederation, another different idea?
I think in the short term, Daniel, that there won't be any political energy to say, let's rewrite the treaties and, transfer this and transfer that. It's just happening without changing the treaties. We talked about migration and protecting borders and how that means that you do international relations with third countries. We haven't changed domestic institutions on foreign policy. You talk about defense coordination. Well, we are just going to do that together or in groups. It's just going to happen. And maybe when the time then is ripe, the dust has settled, and we will see what the new shape of the future EU will be, which is certainly for me, after the final chapter of the Ukrainian conflict, which is what is going to be the position of the free Ukraine. Once that is decided, is it a fully member of the EU? Is it connected to the EU? And so on. Once that's decided, we can see what kind of constitutional setup would be a good setup for an EU of the future. I have an opinion on that. I advocate it in the book and so on. But it's really going to depend on the events that are still unfolding. And I don't think that we have the political will or energy to, we are like a ship or a plane in a storm, and we are not going to rebuild the ship and the plane while we are going through the storm. That's we will see afterwards. That's my. But in the meantime, we will do what is needed, not to crash or sink.
Mm. Thank you so much, Marc. Superpower Europe, the European Union Silent Revolution. Sorry. Thank you for sharing this time with Fide. Thanks for sharing your new book with us. And see you soon.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Appreciate it.